The call came on a Tuesday, shattering the sterile tranquility of my world. One moment, I was observing the elegant dance of gene sequencing on a monitor, the hum of the servers, a comforting lullaby of logic and order. The next, my phone buzzed with the one name I had trained myself to associate with impending chaos: Liam. My brother's voice was a frayed rope pulled taut over a chasm of unspoken panic. He told me I needed to come home. Not that it would be nice to see me, not that I was missed, but that I needed to come home. He said our grandmother Annelise Davenport, the 92-year-old matriarch of our suffocating dynasty, was fading. But it was the phrase that followed that sent a shard of ice through my veins. He said our mother Eleanor insisted I return to fulfill my final duty. Duty. In the Davenport vocabulary, that word was never about love or compassion. It was a currency of obligation, a chain forged from tradition and guilt. I was Dr. Anya Sharma, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. I had built a life 200 miles away, a life of empirical data and verifiable facts, precisely to escape the unwritten, unbreakable laws of Blackwood Manor. I asked him what he meant. What possible duty could I have besides holding my grandmother's hand? Liam's silence was more damning than any answer. He just repeated that I had to come now. The drive south from Baltimore to the rolling hills of Charlottesville, Virginia was a regression. The gleaming glass towers of my chosen world shrank in my rearview mirror, replaced by the ancient gnarled oaks and weathered stone fences that marked the boundaries of the Davenport legacy. With every mile, the carefully constructed walls of my independence felt thinner, more fragile. I had spent a decade building Anya Sharma, the scientist, but the closer I got to that cursed iron gate, the more I felt the ghost of Anya Davenport clawing its way back to the surface. I remembered the arguments, the years of quiet rebellion. My decision to pursue science was seen as an eccentricity. My refusal to marry into one of the other founding families was an unforgivable slight. My mother Eleanor viewed my life's work with a kind of detached disdain. To her, DNA was not a beautiful code of life, but simply a matter of bloodline and inheritance. She spoke of our lineage as if it were a rare thoroughbred animal that needed careful, selective breeding. I had always found it grotesque. Now I was beginning to suspect that her obsession was far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The gates of Blackwood Manor loomed ahead, wrought iron twisted into the shape of thorny roses, a perfect metaphor for my family. The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound that echoed with memories of lonely childhood afternoons and strained holiday dinners. The house itself was a Georgian masterpiece of red brick and white columns, a place that magazines called historic and stately. I called it a prison of expectations. Liam was waiting for me on the porch. His face, usually handsome and assured, was pale and drawn. He looked trapped, a man caught between two worlds, and for a moment I felt a flicker of pity for him. He was the heir, the one who stayed, the one who had to manage both the estate and our mother's iron will. He gave me a brief, clumsy hug that felt more like a plea for forgiveness than a welcome. He told me she was upstairs in her room and that our mother was with her. She led me not to the sitting room for tea, but to my father's old study. This was the heart of Davenport power. Dark mahogany walls were lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read, and oil portraits of grim-faced ancestors staring down with judgmental eyes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel like a tribunal. Liam followed us in and closed the doors, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly final. She led me into the master suite. The room was dark, the heavy damask curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and impending death. Annelise was a shrunken figure in the center of a massive four-poster bed, her skin as translucent as old parchment. Her eyes, however, were still sharp. They found mine, and for a fleeting second I saw the grandmother. I remembered the one who had secretly slipped me novels and encouraged my curiosity before Eleanor's influence had snuffed out her spark. My mother stood before the fireplace, her silhouette framed by the flames. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told me that the family was facing a crisis of continuity. With Liam having only daughters and my own stubborn refusal to marry appropriately, the direct Davenport male line was at an end. I stared at her, uncomprehending. I asked her if she had truly dragged me all the way here, away from my work, to lecture me about my marital status while my grandmother was dying upstairs. Her smile was a thin, bloodless line. She replied that this was about far more than marriage. It was about legacy. It was about the living will. And then she laid it out. Her voice was calm, measured, as if she were discussing a business transaction. She explained a tradition, a secret pact kept by the women of the family for generations. To safeguard the bloodline from unsuitable dilution, a contingency had been established. In the event of a failure in the male line, the youngest fertile daughter of the main branch, which was me, was duty-bound to bear a male heir. I went to her side, taking her frail, cool hand in mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I told her I was here, that I loved her. Her lips moved, but only a faint whisper emerged. Before I could lean closer, Eleanor intervened. She declared that I was tiring her, that Annelise needed her rest. She briskly ushered me out of the room, her hand on my back, a firm, unyielding pressure. She was controlling the narrative, controlling access, controlling everything. She went on, ignoring my shock. She explained that for over a century the family had cryogenically preserved the genetic material of every Davenport patriarch. She told me with a terrifyingly casual air that an appointment had been made for me at a prestigious fertility clinic in Richmond. They would perform an in vitro fertilization procedure. I would be impregnated with the seed of my own great-grandfather. The horror that washed over me was absolute. It was a physical violation, a desecration of science, a violation of my very being. I looked at Liam, my eyes pleading with him to say this was some kind of monstrous joke. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at his hands, his knuckles white. He was a coward, complicit in his silence. I turned back to my mother, my voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like it could split the world in two. I told her she was insane. I told her that as a geneticist I could list 1,000 reasons why this was not only morally repugnant but biologically reckless. I spelled out the catastrophic risks of such profound inbreeding, the genetic diseases, the mutations. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand as if I were a child squabbling over a toy. She stated that our bloodline was strong and that these were acceptable risks for the preservation of their legacy. She then delivered the final, devastating blow. She claimed this was Annelise's dying wish. She said my grandmother would not be able to pass on peacefully until I had agreed to my duty. She was using the woman dying upstairs as emotional blackmail, a human shield for her monstrous ambition. That's when the rage solidified into something cold and hard. Revenge. I didn't know how and I didn't know when, but I knew in that moment that I would not just defy her. I would dismantle her world. I would burn her precious legacy to the ground. I looked my mother dead in the eye. I told her, my voice low and steady, that my body was my own. It was not a vessel, it was not a family heirloom, and it was not a negotiating tool. I told her that I would never under any circumstances submit to this barbaric fantasy. I declared that if she thought she could force me, she had severely underestimated the daughter she had so carelessly tried to mold. I turned to leave, to walk out of that room and that house and never look back. But when I reached for the heavy brass doorknob, it wouldn't turn. It was locked. I spun around. Liam was standing with his back against the wall, his face a mask of misery. My mother hadn't moved from the fireplace. The firelight glinted in her eyes, making them look like chips of obsidian. She spoke, her voice no longer calm but laced with a chilling resolve. She informed me that she had anticipated my reluctance. She said I wouldn't be leaving, not until I had come to my senses and agreed to do what was necessary. She told me I was home now and I would stay here at Blackwood Manor for as long as it took. The house wasn't a home. It was my cage, and the war had just begun. For a long moment, the only sound in the study was the hiss and pop of the fire. My hand was still on the cold, unmoving brass of the doorknob. My mind, a place of logic and sequence, struggled to process the impossible reality I was a prisoner. Not in a cellar with chains, but in a lavishly appointed study, held captive by my own mother's fanaticism and my brother's spineless complicity. The initial shock gave way to a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I rattled the door, my actions a stark contrast to the room's stoic grandeur. I demanded they open it. I shouted that what they were doing was illegal, that it was kidnapping. My voice echoed against the mahogany-paneled walls, absorbed by the leather-bound books that had witnessed generations of Davenport dysfunction. Eleanor watched me, her expression not of anger but of profound disappointment, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum. She told me to stop behaving like a child. She said my hysterics were unbecoming and that this was a private family matter to be resolved with dignity. Dignity. The word was a grotesque mockery in the face of what she was proposing. I fired back, my voice sharp with the precision of a scalpel, asking her what dignity there was in treating her daughter like breeding stock. I explained again slowly, as if to a particularly dim student, the scientific certainty of genetic collapse from such a practice. I listed the probabilities of hemophilia, of cystic fibrosis, of autoimmune disorders that plagued our family tree disorders. I had studied disorders I knew were lurking in our precious bloodline. She was unmoved. She countered my science with mythology. She spoke of legacy as a sacred flame and my duty as the oil needed to keep it from extinguishing. She argued that the Davenport name had survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression. It would not be allowed to perish because of my modern, selfish notions of bodily autonomy. The phrase dripped from her tongue with contempt. I turned my appeal to Liam, who was still plastered against the wall, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I asked him how he, a man with a wife and daughters, could condone this. I questioned what he would do if it were one of his girls decades from now being locked in this room and ordered to sacrifice her body for a name. His face crumpled. He stammered something about responsibility, about the weight of the estate, about promises he had made. He said I didn't understand. Oh, I understood perfectly. He had made a devil's bargain. He had traded his conscience for the comfort and status of Blackwood Manor, and my body was the price. The pity I'd felt for him on the porch curdled into pure disgust. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a chilling clarity. Logic would not work. Emotional appeals were useless. I was dealing with a zealot, and her acolyte was too weak to defy her. I stopped rattling the door. I straightened my shoulders and faced my mother, letting the silence stretch. I decided then that if I couldn't fight them with reason, I would have to find another weapon. My surrender seemed to satisfy Eleanor. She instructed Liam to escort me to my old room. She added that my phone and laptop had been secured in the safe. I would have no contact with the outside world. She would bring me meals herself. They would talk again tomorrow, when she hoped I would be in a more receptive frame of mind. Walking up the grand staircase with Liam trailing behind me was a surreal parody of my childhood. Every step creaked with a familiar groan. The portraits on the wall followed me with their painted eyes, a jury of the dead who had already passed their sentence. Liam tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but I cut him off. I told him not to speak to me, that his silence in the study had said everything I ever needed to hear from him again. The hurt in his eyes gave me a sliver of dark satisfaction. My childhood bedroom was exactly as I had left it a decade ago, preserved like a fly in amber. The walls were still the same pale blue. The collection of academic awards on my shelf gathered a fine layer of dust. My old textbooks on biology and chemistry were neatly stacked on the desk. It was a museum dedicated to a girl who had believed that knowledge could be her escape. Now it was my cell. Liam left without another word, and I heard the click of the key in the lock from the outside. The finality of that sound was a physical blow. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the familiar floral pattern of the quilt doing nothing to comfort me. It was in this room, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, that the full weight of my despair crashed down. I thought of my lab in Baltimore, of my research, of the life I had so painstakingly built. It felt a million miles away, a dream I was waking up from, into this nightmare. My gaze fell upon a small brass microscope on my bookshelf, and a memory sharp and painfully sweet pierced through the fog of my anger. I was 12 years old, and I had found a strange, vibrant moss growing on one of the ancient oaks by the creek. I was fascinated by its structure. My mother had dismissed it as dirt, telling me to come inside before I ruined my dress. Later that evening, my grandmother Annelise had slipped into my room. She carried a heavy velvet-lined box. Inside was the microscope. It was old, belonging to her own father, but the lenses were perfect. She didn't say a word against Eleanor, she never did. Instead, she sat with me for hours, showing me how to prepare a slide. She told me that the world was full of secrets, and that the cleverest people were the ones who knew how to look closely enough to find them. She had whispered that a curious mind was the most valuable inheritance of all, far more precious than land or a name. That was the woman my mother was now using as a weapon against me. The woman who had nurtured the very spark of scientific inquiry that Eleanor now held in contempt. The lie was monstrous. Annelise, the woman who had taught me to look for truth, would never be part of such a grotesque deception. A cold certainty began to form in my mind. Eleanor was lying about my grandmother's dying wish. It was too convenient, too perfectly crafted to manipulate me. It was pure Eleanor. The first night was the longest of my life. I paced the floor, testing the window. It was an old sash window painted shut years ago and reinforced with locks I'd never noticed before. My mother had been planning this. This wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a premeditated plot. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a whisper. The next morning, Liam brought my breakfast tray. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He set the tray down and lingered, his eyes pleading. I ignored him, staring out the window at the sprawling, manicured lawns that had become my prison yard. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. He told me he was sorry. He said that our mother was under immense pressure, that the estate was heavily in debt, and that a clause in Annelise's will stipulated that the bulk of the fortune would only pass to him if there was a guaranteed male heir within 5 years of her death. If not everything, the house, the land, the money would go to a distant, vaguely defined historical preservation trust. The truth when it came was as ugly and banal as I expected. It wasn't about a sacred flame or a noble legacy. It was about money. It was about Liam's fear of losing his inheritance, and Eleanor's terror of losing her status. They were willing to sacrifice my body, my future, and my sanity to maintain their comfortable lives. I finally turned to face him. I told him that his confession didn't make him honorable, it only made him more pathetic. I asked him if he had told his wife Sarah that he was willing to pimp out his sister's womb to keep them in fancy cars and country club memberships. He flinched as if I had slapped him. He insisted it wasn't like that he was trying to protect the family, to protect all of us. He said Eleanor was becoming more and more erratic, obsessed with this plan as the only solution. He was scared of her. A grown man scared of his own mother. He left, locking the door behind him, leaving me with the pieces of this sordid puzzle. The desperation, the financial motive, the lie about my grandmother, it all started to connect. My despair began to recede, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a scientist observing a problem. Eleanor was the disease. The will was the catalyst. My captivity was the symptom. I was not just a victim anymore. I was a researcher trapped in an experiment, and I would find a way to tear that experiment apart cell by cell. My revenge would not be loud and explosive. It would be quiet, precise, and absolute. I would use the very thing they despised in me, my intellect, my methodical nature, to dismantle their world from the inside out. I started to examine my room not as a prison but as a laboratory. I took stock of every object, every loose floorboard, every memory. They thought they had caged an errant daughter. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in with a predator. The first week of my imprisonment was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and my mother was the commanding general. The days bled into a monotonous rhythm of confinement and coercion. Eleanor would visit me 3 times a day, bringing my meals on a silver tray as if I were a guest with a mild illness rather than a captive. Each visit was a carefully orchestrated assault. She never raised her voice. Instead, she would speak in calm, reasoned tones about the future, a future she had designed in which I was merely a biological instrument. She talked about nurseries, about the reopening of the long-shuttered East Wing for the new family. She even mentioned names, pulling them from the moldering tapestry of our ancestry. She spoke of all this as if my consent was a foregone conclusion, a minor procedural delay. Every word was a needle intended to strip away my identity and replace it with the single dehumanizing function she had assigned me, bearer of the Davenport heir. My suffering peaked on the 8th day. Eleanor informed me with the placid air of someone announcing a guest for tea that a doctor would be visiting that afternoon. She called it a preliminary consultation, a chance for me to ask any questions. I felt the air leave my lungs. This was no longer an abstract, monstrous idea. She was bringing the architecture of my violation into my home, into my room. Dr. Alistair Finch was exactly the kind of man I despised. He was older, with a practiced bedside manner that was more condescending than comforting. He carried a leather briefcase and smelled of expensive cologne and moral compromise. Eleanor introduced him as a leader in the field of reproductive medicine, a man who understood the unique needs of families like ours. I saw him for what he was, a hired gun in a white coat willing to trade his Hippocratic oath for a sizable donation to his clinic. He tried to speak to me as a colleague, mentioning my work at Johns Hopkins. He said he admired my research. The words were meant to disarm me, to create a false sense of professional courtesy. I saw the strategy for what it was, an attempt to make the unthinkable seem professional, even collaborative. My mother sat in the corner, observing her posture radiating smug certainty. I remained silent, staring at him. My mind, my greatest weapon, was racing. I catalogued every detail, the slight tremor in his hand as he opened his briefcase, the way his eyes avoided mine. For more than a second, the subtle sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He was nervous. He knew what he was doing was unethical, likely illegal. He was a man driven by greed, not conviction. He began to explain the procedure in sterile clinical terms, using acronyms and medical jargon as a shield. He spoke of hormone treatments, of egg retrieval, of the implantation process. He was describing the systematic violation of my body, and he did so with the emotional detachment of a mechanic explaining an oil change. That was my breaking point. The rage that had been simmering within me boiled over, but it did not manifest as shouting. It was cold, sharp, and precise. I interrupted him mid-sentence. I told him I knew exactly what the procedure entailed. And then, looking him directly in the eyes, I began to cross-examine him. I asked him if he had submitted this proposed course of treatment to an ethics board. I asked if he was aware of Virginia's statutes regarding informed consent and medical coercion. I began citing specific genetic markers prevalent in Ashkenazi Jewish populations, similar to those found in reproductively isolated groups like the Davenports, and asked him to provide his risk analysis for congenital defects. I used my knowledge, my own expertise as a shield and a sword. Dr. Finch's professional veneer cracked. He stammered, closing his briefcase. He looked to my mother for support, but I didn't let up. I told him that if he proceeded, I would dedicate the rest of my life to his absolute and utter professional ruin. I would report him to the American Medical Association. I would file a lawsuit that would strip him of his license and his clinic. I promised him with the calm certainty of a scientist, stating a fact that I would become the single greatest regret of his career. He stood up abruptly, mumbling about a misunderstanding, and all but fled the room. Eleanor's face was a storm cloud of fury. The mask had slipped. For the first time, she had lost control. She hissed at me that I was a fool, that I had chased away their best option. Eleanor's face was a fool that I had chased away their best option. The moment she left, slamming and locking the door, the terror and violation I felt from the doctor's visit began to recede. In its place, a new feeling bloomed, the cold, clean, deeply satisfying thrill of a successful counterattack. The suffering had peaked, and now the revenge would begin in earnest. My pain would be the fuel. My first target was Liam. He was the weak link consumed by guilt. That evening, when he brought my dinner tray, I refused it. I told him I wasn't hungry. The next morning, I refused breakfast. He asked me, his voice fraught with worry, what was wrong. I told him simply that a cage, no matter how gilded, tended to spoil one's appetite. I had begun a hunger strike. It was a quiet internal protest, but I knew it would be excruciating for him. Every meal he brought that I refused was another testament to his betrayal. I watched the guilt eat away at him day by day. His shoulders slumped, dark circles formed under his eyes. He started pleading with me to eat, saying our mother would be furious. I would just look at him, my silence, a more potent accusation than any words. Every pang of my own hunger was sharpened by the exquisite satisfaction of watching him unravel. My suffering was now a weapon, and it was working beautifully. My second target was Eleanor's sanctuary, her perfect, orderly house. She thrived on control, on the immaculate presentation of Blackwood Manor. I would introduce a variable, she couldn't manage chaos. My old chemistry set was long gone, but my knowledge remained. My bedroom was a laboratory of opportunity. I found a bottle of sulfur-based shampoo for treating dandruff in the back of my bathroom cabinet, a forgotten relic from my teenage years. In my desk drawer, I found a small bottle of acidic cleaning solution for removing rust stains from my old drawing nibs. Under the cover of night, I worked. I mixed the two in an old perfume bottle. The reaction was slow, but the result was precisely what I wanted, a small but potent quantity of hydrogen sulfide. The smell of rotten eggs. It was vile, pervasive, and incredibly difficult to trace. I poured a small amount down the back of an old radiator in my room. Within hours, a faint, foul odor began to seep out. It was subtle at first. I watched with grim satisfaction as Eleanor would enter my room, her nose twitching slightly. She would blame the old plumbing, the damp weather, but I was patient. Each night I added a little more to my concoction. The smell grew stronger, creeping out from under my door and infesting the grand hallway. I heard Eleanor berating the housekeeping staff, their hushed, fearful replies echoing from downstairs. I heard her on the phone with a plumber, her voice tight with frustration as he insisted there was nothing wrong with the pipes. Her perfect house was being tainted by an invisible enemy. Her inability to locate and eliminate the source was a direct assault on her authority. Every time I saw the wrinkle of disgust on her face, the knot of frustration in her brow, the dull ache in my own stomach from lack of food was replaced by a surge of triumphant pleasure. I was a ghost in her machine, systematically corrupting her perfect world. My third and most ambitious act of the week required opportunity. It came on the 5th day of my hunger strike. Liam, now a nervous wreck, brought my lunch. In his haste to try and coax me to eat, he failed to ensure the door was fully locked behind him when he left. I heard the bolt slide but not click home. It was the mistake I had been waiting for. I waited an hour, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic beat. then I slipped out. The house was silent. My target was my mother's bedroom, the inner sanctum. I knew exactly what I was looking for. On her vanity table, among the silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume bottles, was a small antique locket. It had belonged to Annelise. It held two tiny, faded portraits, one of her as a young woman and one of her late husband. It was the one piece of jewelry Eleanor wore that held genuine sentimental value, a link to the mother she was so despicably using. I took it. I didn't run. I walked calmly back to my room, my bare feet silent on the thick Persian runner. Back in my cell, I pried up a loose floorboard beneath my rug, a secret hiding place I had used as a child for forbidden novels. I wrapped the locket in a handkerchief and placed it in the dark, dusty space. The explosion was not immediate, but it was magnificent. 2 days later, a controlled chaos erupted downstairs. I could hear Eleanor's sharp, frantic questions to the staff. I heard her accusing them of theft. Her composure, already strained by the mysterious odor, was shattering. She had lost something irreplaceable, something that connected her to her own humanity and to the very mother she was leveraging as a pawn. That evening, when she brought my tray, her eyes were red-rimmed. For the first time, I saw not a tyrant but a woman unmoored. She had lost control of her house, she was losing control of her son's loyalty, and now a piece of her past was gone. She looked at me, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, but she couldn't prove anything. I was the locked-away daughter, the helpless victim. I met her gaze, my own face, a placid mask. Inside, I was electric. The gnawing emptiness in my stomach was gone, filled completely by a feeling of cold, absolute power. The pain of my ordeal was no longer a burden. It was a crucible. It had burned away my fear and helplessness, leaving behind something hard, sharp, and unbreakable. They had wanted a vessel. Instead, they had forged a weapon. And I was just getting started. The second week of my captivity began not with a bang, but with a carefully calibrated shift in strategy. My initial acts of sabotage, the hunger strike, the foul odor, the stolen locket, were about psychological disruption. They were designed to fray the nerves of my captors and shatter the illusion of their control. Now it was time for the second phase, a controlled demolition of the pillars supporting my mother's authority. Her power rested on three things: Liam's obedience, the family's reputation, and the perceived legitimacy of her plan. I would dismantle all three piece by piece, using my intellect as the primary weapon. My hunger strike had successfully eroded Liam's resolve. By day 10, he was a ghost haunted by his complicity. He began leaving small notes with my untouched food trays scribbled on torn pieces of napkin. At first, they were simple pleas for me to eat. Then they became apologies. By day 12, they were confessions. He wrote that our mother had been planning this for months, ever since Annelise's health had taken a sharp decline. He admitted that he had stood to inherit a separate personal trust from our grandmother, but Eleanor had convinced him to sign it over to her, leveraging his future compliance. He had essentially sold his soul before he even knew the full price. His notes were my first concrete pieces of evidence, and I tucked each one away in the hollow space beneath the floorboard alongside the locket. My next move was to weaponize his guilt. During one of his lunchtime visits, as he was begging me to just have a piece of toast, I spoke to him for the first time in days. My voice was weak from lack of food, which only added to the effect. I didn't yell or accuse. I simply asked him to look at me. I told him to truly look at what he was helping our mother do. I asked him what Sarah, his wife, would think if she knew the truth. I spoke her name softly, deliberately. Sarah was a kind woman, an outsider, who had never fully been accepted by Eleanor because she didn't come from the right kind of family. She adored her daughters and believed in Liam's fundamental goodness. The mention of her name was like turning a key in a lock. I told him I wasn't just fighting for myself but for his daughters too. I explained that if Eleanor succeeded with me, she would have established a horrifying precedent. I painted a picture for him of a future where his own girls could be subjected to the same fanatical obsession with bloodlines, their bodies viewed as assets of the estate. I told him he wasn't just failing his sister, he was failing his children. I saw the final wall of his defense crumble. The fear of our mother was finally eclipsed by the fear of what he was becoming. That evening, he didn't just leave a note. He slipped my phone under the dinner plate. It had been powered down, but it was there. With it was a single hastily scribbled message: "I can't do this anymore. What do you need?" The return of my phone was like a lungful of oxygen after nearly suffocating. I waited until the dead of night, huddled under my blankets to hide the screen's glow. My hands trembled as I powered it on. The first phase of my plan was complete. I had turned my jailer into an ally. Now for the second pillar, the family's reputation. My mother prided herself on the pristine image of the Davenports. We were old money paragons of Virginian high society. This reputation was maintained through a carefully curated network of social connections, at the heart of which was the annual Davenport Foundation Charity Luncheon, a major event for the region's elite. It was scheduled to take place in 2 weeks, and I was going to turn it into a bomb. Using my phone, I began my research. My first target was the family's finances. Eleanor's power was built on wealth, and I suspected it was not as secure as she pretended. Liam's notes had given me a starting point. I spent hours navigating the labyrinth of public records, searching for deeds, tax liens, and corporate filings related to the Davenport estate. It was slow, tedious work, but my mind, trained to find patterns in complex datasets, was perfectly suited for the task. I discovered that the estate was dangerously over-leveraged. My father had made a series of disastrous investments before he died, and Eleanor had been borrowing against the land for years to maintain their lavish lifestyle. The will wasn't just about an heir. It was a desperate lifeline to unlock the final portion of the family trust and stave off bankruptcy. The Davenport legacy was a house of cards, and I had just found the gust of wind I needed. My second target was Dr. Alistair Finch. A man so easily swayed by money was bound to have skeletons. I delved into online medical forums, legal databases, and patient review sites. I found whispers, vague complaints of him pressuring patients into expensive and unnecessary treatments. Then I founded a malpractice lawsuit from 7 years ago, settled out of court and sealed. The details were hidden, but the plaintiff's name was not. Using a secure encrypted messaging app, I contacted Liam. I gave him a set of precise, simple instructions. I needed him to get me 3 things: a recent photo of the sealed malpractice suit documents from the family lawyer's office. Our lawyer was, of course, on the firm's board, a copy of the catering contract for the upcoming luncheon, and a discreet pay-as-you-go burner phone. I told him to leave them in the hollow of the old oak tree by the creek, the same place Annelise and I used to leave secret notes for each other. It was a risk, but I was betting everything on his shattered conscience. 2 nights later, the package was there. The documents were even more damning than I'd hoped. The lawsuit involved a couple whom Dr. Finch had coerced into a risky experimental procedure, resulting in a severe birth defect. He had buried it, but the evidence was now in my hands. The final stage of my plan was to set the trap. Using the burner phone, I created an anonymous encrypted email address. I drafted 2 emails. The first was to the most notorious gossip columnist in Virginia's high society, a woman whose pen could make or break reputations overnight. I wrote a blind item tip, a juicy, anonymous piece of gossip. I didn't mention the Davenports by name. I simply wrote about a prominent, old-money Virginia family on the brink of financial collapse who was pressuring their accomplished daughter into a medically and morally questionable arrangement to secure an inheritance, all under the guidance of a Richmond doctor with a history of malpractice. I attached a heavily redacted but still tantalizing snippet of the lawsuit. I scheduled the email to be sent the morning of the charity luncheon. The second email was to the catering company. Posing as my mother's assistant, I wrote a polite but firm message confirming a last-minute dietary change for the head table. I stated that due to a severe and sudden onset sulfur allergy affecting a key donor, no dishes containing eggs, onions, or garlic could be served. It was a ridiculous, almost impossible demand for a large-scale catering event guaranteed to cause chaos in the kitchen and significantly alter the menu. It was my callback to my first act of defiance, a signature written in rotten eggs. With the emails scheduled and the seeds of chaos sown, I felt a profound sense of calm. My hunger had sharpened my senses, my confinement had focused my mind. Eleanor believed she was breaking me, forcing me into submission. She had no idea that I was in my room not as a prisoner but as a strategist in my war room. I was directing a symphony of her destruction, and the opening notes were about to play. She thought she was in control of the reaction. She was about to learn that she was nothing more than an unstable element in my equation, and the result would be explosive. The day of the Davenport Foundation charity luncheon dawned bright and clear, a perfect Virginia autumn day that was utterly at odds with the tempest I had engineered. From my window, I watched the procession of expensive cars crawl up the long gravel driveway. I saw women in designer dresses and men in crisp suits, their laughter carrying on the breeze, a flock of beautifully plumed vultures gathering for a feast, completely unaware that they were about to witness a slaughter. I had broken my fast that morning with a piece of toast and a glass of water brought by a visibly relieved Liam. I needed my strength for the performance to come. My imprisonment had become a strategic retreat. Eleanor, consumed by the luncheon preparations and agitated by the still unexplained disappearance of her locket and the lingering foul odor in the West Wing, had left me largely alone. Her visits had become brief, perfunctory affairs. She mistook my quiet compliance for resignation. She had no idea I was a spider patiently waiting in the center of a web that was about to be violently shaken. The first tremor hit around noon. Through the floorboards, I could hear the muffled sounds of a crisis unfolding in the kitchen. A raised voice, the head caterer, I presumed, followed by my mother's sharp, imperious tones. My last-minute impossible dietary demand had landed. I pictured the chaos chef's scrambling menus being frantically rewritten, the carefully planned symphony of the meal descending into frantic improvisation. It was a small, petty act, but it was the perfect overture. It set the stage, creating a background hum of anxiety and incompetence that would amplify the main event. Eleanor's perfect day was already beginning to fray at the edges, and the guests hadn't even finished their first glass of champagne. The second, more powerful tremor came an hour later. I knew the exact moment the gossip columnist's email blast went out. I imagined the synchronized chime and buzz of 100 phones being checked under elegantly set tables. I pictured the furtive glances, the sudden intense whispers breaking through the polite chatter. The blind item was a virus I had released into a closed system, and I knew it would spread with breathtaking speed. It was perfectly crafted to hit all their weak spots: old money scandal and the delicious thrill of a dynasty's potential fall from grace. They wouldn't know for certain it was about the Davenports, but the context, the event, the location, the whispers of financial trouble that always shadow old wealth would make the connection irresistible. Liam was my eyes and ears. He sent me a string of frantic one-word texts from the ballroom. Whispering. Everyone. Staring. And then the one I was waiting for: Finch is here. He looks sick. Of course, Dr. Finch was there. He was a prospective beneficiary of my mother's generosity, a guest of honor. He would be at the head table right next to Eleanor. He would be one of the first to feel the heat. The climax arrived with the brutal precision I had planned. Liam had, per my instructions, accidentally let slip to a notoriously chatty cousin that Dr. Finch was overseeing a delicate family matter related to Annelise's inheritance. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the key that connected the doctor, the family, and the blind item. I watched from my window as a small exodus began. Dr. Finch was the first to leave, practically fleeing to his car without so much as a goodbye. His departure was a signal, a confirmation of the rumors. Other guests soon followed, offering hasty, awkward excuses to my mother. The meticulously planned social event was hemorrhaging attendees. The luncheon was collapsing in real time. Later, Liam described the scene to me, his voice hollow with a mixture of horror and awe. He said Eleanor had stood at the head of the ballroom like the captain of a sinking ship, her smile frozen on her face, her eyes darting around with a bewildered panic. She had tried to give her keynote speech, but the room was half empty, the remaining guests too busy whispering and staring at their phones to pay attention. He said he had never seen her look so small, so utterly powerless. The Davenport name, the currency she had traded her daughter's soul for, was being devalued with every guest that walked out the door. Her reputation, the bedrock of her identity, was turning to sand beneath her feet. When she finally came upstairs hours later, she was no longer the imperious general. The mask was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was just a woman stripped of her armor, her face pale and drawn. She didn't unlock my door. She just stood outside it, and for the first time her voice, when it came through the thick oak, was not a command but a broken whisper. She asked me how I could do this. She accused me of destroying the family. There was no fire in her words, only the cold, dead ash of defeat. I walked to the door, pressing my forehead against the cool wood. I spoke to her, my own voice, even and steady. I told her that she was the one who had destroyed it. I explained that I had simply held up a mirror and the world had finally seen the ugliness she had tried to hide. I told her that a legacy built on coercion and cruelty was not a legacy at all. It was a curse, and I had simply helped it die. I heard a sound like a choked sob, followed by the soft thud of her slumping against the door from the other side. We sat there for a long time, separated by a few inches of wood, two strangers locked in a stalemate of our own making. Her impenetrable fortress of pride and tradition had been breached, and she had no idea how. The unknown was eating her alive. My calculated revenge had done more than just ruin her party. It had annihilated her certainty, the very core of her being. My final act that night was for Liam. When he brought my dinner, his face a mess of conflicting emotions, I met him at the door. I told him it was over. Then I reached under the loose floorboard and retrieved the antique locket. I placed it in his hand. I told him to give it back to her and to tell her that some things once lost could never truly be recovered. He stared at the locket, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. He finally saw the depth of my planning, the chilling precision of my actions. He saw that I hadn't just been a victim reacting to pain. I had been a strategist several moves ahead the entire time. The realization didn't seem to bring him peace. It terrified him. He was seeing his sister, the quiet, bookish girl, for the first time as the woman she had become, someone forged into steel in the fires of his family's making. He stumbled away, the locket clutched in his hand like a holy relic from a forgotten war, leaving me in the quiet, victorious solitude of my room. The dead silence from my mother's side of the door was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The aftermath of the luncheon was not a storm, but a profound and unsettling silence. The house, which had once felt oppressive with its weight of tradition, now felt hollow, haunted by the ghosts of what had been shattered. My door was unlocked the following morning. There was no announcement, no confrontation. I simply turned the handle and it opened. The war was over and there had been no formal surrender, only a quiet, unconditional retreat. I walked out of my room for the first time in over 2 weeks. The air in the hallway felt strange, the light from the tall windows seemed unnaturally bright. I was a deep-sea creature emerging into the sun. I walked downstairs, my steps echoing in the cavernous silence. I found Liam in the study, the same room where my nightmare had begun. He was sitting in my father's old leather chair, staring into the cold, empty fireplace. He looked older, diminished. The locket was on the desk beside him. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He told me that our mother had locked herself in her suite and refused to see anyone. The locket remained on the desk, an unclaimed piece of the past. He said that after he had shown it to her, she had simply looked at him with empty eyes and told him that it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. The intricate web of reputation and social standing she had spent her life weaving had been torn apart in a single afternoon, and she had nothing left. It was then that Liam finally confessed everything, filling in the last sordid details of the conspiracy. The betrayal was deeper and colder than I had imagined. The plan had not been a recent invention born of desperation. Eleanor had been cultivating it for years, a dark seed planted ever since it became clear I would not follow the path she had laid out for me. She had viewed my ambition, my intelligence, and my independence not as virtues but as liabilities to be managed and eventually subjugated. The clause in Annelise's will was real, but my mother had used it as the perfect excuse to enact a plan she had long fantasized about, a way to finally bend me to her will, to force me back into the Davenport fold on her terms. He admitted, his voice thick with shame, that he had known about it for over a year. He had been her unwilling co-conspirator, placated by her promises that I would come around and that it was all for the good of the family. He had allowed himself to believe her lies because the truth was too ugly to confront. He confessed that the real betrayal wasn't just locking me in a room, it was the years of watching her resentment towards me fester and doing nothing to stop it. He had chosen comfort over courage, and the price had been his soul. I listened without interruption. There was no satisfaction in his confession, no thrill of victory. There was only a vast, empty sadness. I had won. I had systematically dismantled their world, but standing in the rubble, I felt no joy. I only felt the profound weight of what had been irrevocably broken. Later that day, I went to see my grandmother. The house was so still that I was surprised to find a nurse sitting quietly in a chair by her bedside. She told me Annelise had been calm, sleeping more than usual. I sat by the bed, taking her thin, cool hand in mine. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear. She looked at me, a flicker of recognition of love in their depths. I didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need. Instead, I told her about my work. I described the beauty of the double helix, the elegant logic of the genetic code. I told her about the secrets I was trying to unlock, the ones hidden in our very cells. I told her that she was the one who had given me the microscope, the one who had first taught me how to look closely at the world. I told her that my curious mind, the one she had nurtured, was the most valuable inheritance she could ever have given me. A single tear traced a path through the delicate wrinkles by her eye, and she squeezed my hand, a faint, fleeting pressure that said everything. It was our final goodbye. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 nights later. I didn't stay for the funeral. My presence would have been a spectacle, a source of more gossip and speculation. My revenge was complete, but my purpose there was finished. Liam walked me to my car. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply handed me a thick envelope. He told me it was the trust he had signed over to our mother. After the luncheon, he had found his courage. He had confronted her and their lawyers, threatening to expose the entire sordid affair of my confinement if they didn't invalidate the contract. He had reclaimed his agency, a small belated act of defiance. He told me he was selling most of the land. He was going to pay off the debts and create a smaller, more honest life for his wife and daughters, free from the crushing weight of a legacy that had cost them all so much. He wanted me to have the trust, saying it was the only restitution he could offer. I took the envelope, not as payment but as a closing statement. I told him that the lesson here wasn't about money or land. It was about the fact that you can't build a future by sacrificing your children to the ghosts of the past. A legacy, I told him, isn't something you inherit. It's something you build with your own choices, with your own integrity. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a grief that would likely shadow him for the rest of his life. As I drove away from Blackwood Manor, I didn't look back. The iron gates, the stone walls, the towering columns, they no longer held any power over me. They were just brick and mortar, a monument to a hollow dynasty. My mother had tried to make my body a prison for her ambitions. She had failed. My brother had tried to trade my future for his security. He had failed. They had wanted me to be the vessel for the Davenport legacy. But I had walked out of that house with my own inheritance. It wasn't in a will or a bank account. It was the fierce, unshakable knowledge of my own strength. It was the cold, hard certainty that I would never again allow anyone to define my worth or dictate the terms of my existence. I had been pushed to the edge and had discovered that I had the strength not only to survive but to fight back with a precision and intelligence they had never imagined. That was my inheritance. And it was one I would carry with me not as a burden but as a shield for the rest of my life.